Ukraine claims it's destroyed some 96 Russian cruise missiles in one of the most successful strikes of the war, as President Zelensky says Vladimir Putin will die soon, and a fragile ceasefire appears to falter. Kharkiv again. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news and analysis from the war in Ukraine. We're starting with claims from Ukraine's general staff about the strike we talked about last week on the Russian airbase Engels 2, a strategic airbase home to long-range Russian bombers which have repeatedly been used to bomb Ukraine. Ukraine managed to hit it with its long-range drones. It's some 400 miles from the closest Ukrainian territory. You'll remember there was extraordinary footage of an enormous mushroom cloud billowing into the sky, and the reason for that was that Ukraine hit a Russian ammunition dump. These are really high-value targets. Now, it was clear that something big had been hit from that footage that we were talking about last week, but Ukraine's general staff have today released claims that in that bunker, or those bunkers, were 96 Russian cruise missiles, including both the KH-101 and the KH-555 air-launched cruise missiles. These are weapons that have caused devastation across Ukraine. They tend to be used more sparingly than the drones, the Shahed drones, which we see scores of them launched every single night. And very specifically, Ukraine said that actually these 96 Russian cruise missiles that they destroyed were going to be used in 3 strikes over the course of March and April. So revealing in 2 ways. Revealing because they've given a lot of detail about what they think they hit, how valuable it was, and a suggestion that this will set Russia back by a couple of months, but only a couple of months. 100 cruise missiles may limit Russia perhaps only for the next 2 months. I've spent time at research laboratories inside Ukraine where they analyse the wreckage of Russian missiles, and what was so interesting about that was that they could work out from the serial numbers of the weapons that are being fired at them when they were produced. And one of the important things that came through from that was how high-value missiles and weapons like these cruise missiles were going from the factory to the front line very, very quickly, and that was a sign, the Ukrainians said, that Russian stockpiles were very, very thin. So a spectacular success for Ukraine. Details of that emerging today. And of course, those strikes come despite these fragile ceasefires that have been brokered by the United States between Russia and Ukraine. Most recently, as a result of ongoing talks in Saudi Arabia, America has said that Ukraine and Russia have agreed to a ceasefire in the Black Sea. But of course, actually, it's more complicated than that. We'd already had, allegedly, both Russia and Ukraine agreeing to a pause on strikes on energy infrastructure. But both sides have accused each other of breaking that ceasefire. And one of the difficulties is there's no text of these agreements in the public domain for us to examine and understand whether one side is or isn't breaching the terms. And that's even more complicated with this Black Sea ceasefire, because Russia, after it was agreed, then announced a whole sort of raft of conditions that it wanted met before it agreed to the terms. And those conditions included lifting sanctions on some of its banks to try and restart its grain exports and its international trade. From Ukraine's point of view, Ukraine has already established, in many senses, naval dominance of the Black Sea, certainly of the surface fleets. Russia has been forced to abandon its naval headquarters in Sebastopol to all extents and purposes and move its warships to the eastern edge of the Black Sea beyond the working range of most of, not all of, but most of Ukraine's drone strikes. But Russia has continued to use submarines and warships to launch Caliber cruise missiles from the sea at targets across Ukraine. And clearly taking that out of the equation for Ukraine will perhaps make it slightly easier, but only slightly, for Ukraine to try and defend itself from the airstrikes, the missile strikes, which continue on an almost nightly basis. What's very clear from how Russia's been behaving is that Moscow is playing for time. Appear to agree to something, then introduce complications, introduce clauses. We saw that after that phone call between Trump and Putin, where Russia sort of invents problems and then demands solutions. We've seen that after this announcement of the Black Sea ceasefire. And even Donald Trump appears to recognize that. He said he thought Russia was dragging its feet. Rare criticism of the Russian approach from Donald Trump. What's interesting is that playing for time and dragging feet appears to go against what Zelensky has said on a trip to Paris, that Vladimir Putin will die soon. Now, this was a slightly off-the-hand remark. It's fueled lots of fervid speculation about President Putin's health, a favourite topic for watchers of this conflict and a favourite topic certainly for supporters of Ukraine. There's been lots of speculation about Vladimir Putin's health. Has he been struck down with a fatal disease? Suggestions that his hands are shaking, he's puffy-faced. I have to say, I've repeatedly asked this of people within the security infrastructure, national security infrastructure, and have never had a satisfactory answer back. No one has ever said to me convincingly that they believe or they have evidence that Vladimir Putin's health is failing. Nonetheless, worth noting, that is what Zelensky said. Putin will die soon, and he said all of this will be over. Now, hard to know whether he had anything specific that he was basing that on, or was it really a comment getting to the fact that this is Vladimir Putin who is driving this conflict. And of course, nobody lives forever. As an aside, also worth noting that Zelensky appeared to sort of dismiss Steve Witkoff, well, who's been acting as Donald Trump's envoy. Witkoff was saying that a lot of people in occupied parts of Ukraine want to be ruled by Russia. Zelensky suggested that Witkoff knows a lot about real estate, but doesn't know a lot about diplomacy. So a slightly offhand dismissal of somebody very close to Donald Trump, fraught with risk, those sorts of comments given what we saw in the Oval Office. On the battlefield, most recently, Russia has launched some 86 drones at Ukraine, targeting mainly 4 regions: Kharkiv, Sumy, Dnipro and Chernihiv. Ukraine said it managed to down about half of them. And another 26, it said, were decoys, but that still suggests around 20 of them got through, and reports of multiple people and significant damage, multiple people injured and significant damage. The other thing I want to talk about today, the final thing before we get to questions, is what's happening in Kursk oblast. You remember, Ukraine captured around 1,000 square kilometers at the peak of its surprise invasion in August. They have been under huge pressure there, and just in the last week or 10 days, the area that Ukraine has controlled, according to the deep state map which tracks the conflict, the area Ukraine controls has shrunk from about, I think, 110 square kilometers now down to a little bit over 70 square kilometers. And it's here in Kursk that Trump, I think, falsely claimed that thousands of Ukrainian soldiers were surrounded, and he made that bizarre appeal to President Putin's mercy to spare their lives. The reason I want to talk about it today is because we know that Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, Alexander Syrsky, so the most senior uniformed officer in Ukraine, has been visiting Sumy. That is the province on the Ukrainian side of the border from where Ukraine has been supporting those troops in Kursk. And in a statement, his office said that he's made the decision to reinforce those troops with more soldiers, more ammunition and drones. Now, the main role, the suggestion is, for those troops now is actually to prevent Russia breaking through and invading Ukrainian territory there. There's no doubt that Ukraine, under huge pressure, is fighting a rear guard action. The troops were not surrounded, but what Russia did successfully manage to do, we think primarily through use of lots of drones and specialist drone teams, was to choke Ukraine's logistics. There was only a handful of roads by which Ukraine could supply those troops in Kursk. The shape of Ukraine, the territory that it held, was so long and thin, and that exposed Ukraine to attacks effectively on 3 sides, which played, in a sense, to Russia's strength, especially to Russia's strengths once they got those drones in, and of course they were reinforced by North Korean troops. For now, Ukraine appears to be clinging on to a tiny pocket of Russian territory in Kursk, and it's doing so to stop Russia attacking Sumy. As ever, if you've got any questions, please do ask them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can next time, either on the show or I'll get into the comments as well. And remember, you can now join Frontline, and that will give you exclusive early access to members-only videos. You'll get priority questions, and you also get to use a whole range of exclusive Frontline emojis as well, which I've been starting to use in the comments, as you may see. 4 questions from last week, which we're going to look at today. Number 1. If North Korean troops were found inside Ukrainian territory, would that compel NATO or Ukraine's allies to deploy their troops inside? Now, the reason that question is topical is because those North Korean troops have been fighting in Kursk, and the Russian and North Korean forces in Kursk have potentially advanced right up to the Ukrainian borders. The short answer to the question is no. If North Koreans crossed into Ukraine, that would not compel NATO to do anything. It might be seen as a significant escalation, but Ukraine is not a NATO member. There is no Article 5 clause. An attack by North Korea would not create any legal obligation to change the way allies are supporting Ukraine. I suspect it may well cause outrage. It may be a trigger for perhaps more support for Ukraine, but hard at this stage to know exactly what allies could do to significantly change their support to Ukraine. Question number 2, how do you convince Ukraine to knock out Moscow and St. Petersburg's electricity grids? Clearly this is a reflection, or this is a question because Russia's been doing this to Ukraine, suggesting this would have a huge impact on Russians. I think there's 2 reasons, well 3 reasons. Firstly, right now you couldn't convince Ukraine to do that because there is a ceasefire, the limited ceasefire on land is focused on a pause on strikes on energy infrastructure. So to do that would be a direct violation of that ceasefire. But were that ceasefire not in effect, were we sort of rolling back the clock a few weeks or months to before that came in, why isn't Ukraine doing that? Well, possibly because Ukraine doesn't have at its disposal the same range of missiles and weapons to try and knock out Russia's energy grid. And the nature of an energy grid is when you knock out one part, other parts can take over the supply. And that's what we've seen in Ukraine, to extraordinary resilience and ingenuity to try and keep the lights on. Russia, obviously a much bigger country, much of the energy infrastructure much further away from Ukraine. It's almost impossible. And what you've seen Ukraine do instead is focus on the oil and gas infrastructure inside Russia. So degrading oil refineries to try and limit Russia's production, degrading oil depots to degrade Russia's supply, both in terms of export opportunities and crucially in terms of fuel to supply its troops on the front line. We've got a question about Heathrow Airport, so slightly off topic from Ukraine, but you may remember there was a substation fire in London which knocked out power to Heathrow Airport. Europe's busiest airport was effectively closed. And the question is, why was security at the substation not better? This speaks to the suggestion that perhaps this fire was caused by Russian sabotage. I have to confess, I had exactly the same thoughts. So did many people I spoke to, security experts, Kremlin, people watching the Kremlin and understand Russia's way of working. However, there is, according to the British police, no evidence to suggest that this fire was caused by sabotage, so security was not the problem. It was, we think at this stage, an electrical fault, but more details yet to be forthcoming. But there's no suggestion that there was sabotage or any Russian involvement. The final question today is, why is Ukraine not making more use of dirigibles? I hope I'm pronouncing that word correctly, but essentially this is airships, barrage balloons to try and defend targets from drones and missiles. Of course, these were techniques that were used a lot during World War I to try and defend the United Kingdom from the German Luftwaffe. Ukraine is using all manner of defences, including, interestingly, acoustic sensors as a means of detecting drones. But that's another tactic that was used, first of all, I think, in World War I, because especially those Shahed drones are so noisy and relatively slow flying that an array of mobile phones can pinpoint, triangulate direction based on tracking sounds from multiple locations. We haven't seen evidence of the dirigibles. That may be, I suspect, primarily due to the main threat coming from ballistic and cruise missiles, the flight path of those being different, that they come in almost directly, in some cases directly from a vertical angle. Not clear why they're not being used to defend against drones, but perhaps because Ukraine has its other defences, is focused instead on its other defences, which ranges from the heavy machine gun, the flat gun to shoot them down, to the guided missiles like the Starstreaks and ultimately the SAMP-Ts, NASAMs, and their largest weapons, the Patriot missiles. Thank you for watching. If you've got any questions, please do ask them below. I'll answer as many as I can and look forward to seeing you next time. We're in a Ukrainian armoured vehicle and we're heading towards the Russian border.